The Second World War killed more than 70 million people between 1939 and 1945. It destroyed empires. It erased entire cities from the map. When the world tried to move on, when the survivors burned their gas masks in the VE Day bonfires and governments archived their classified documents, the war did not disappear. It kept waiting, buried under the soil of Polish forests, under the glaciers of California, under the fields of Manchuria, under the foundations of military installations that no official map recognized. In the 21st century, the Earth has begun to speak. Archaeologists, forensic researchers, peasants, schoolchildren with metal detectors, and workers opening trenches for pipes have unearthed the last secrets of that conflict. In February 2024, a group of archaeologists and historians from the Lair Foundation arrived at the remains of the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's main headquarters on the Eastern Front, located in what were then the forests of East Prussia and today belong to northeastern Poland near Kętrzyn. The objective was to document the state of conservation of the underground structures and bunkers that still remain standing, mostly detonated by German forces in January 1945, before their retreat in the face of the Soviet advance. What nobody expected was what they found under the floor of the residence of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The Wolf's Lair was built in 1941. It occupied more than 250 hectares of thick and swampy forest, camouflaged under camouflage nets and artificial trees. It was divided into 3 concentric security zones, and only the inner circle, the first security zone, housed the highest figures of the Third Reich. There resided Hitler, Martin Bormann, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, and Göring himself. The complex eventually had more than 2,000 permanent personnel. On July 20, 1944, in that same enclosure, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb under Hitler's conference table. The detonation killed 4 people and injured more than 20. Hitler survived with minor injuries. The assassination attempt failed. Von Stauffenberg was executed that same night in Berlin. But what the archaeologists of the Lair Foundation discovered in 2024 had nothing to do with the assassination attempt. Under what had been an old bathroom located in the basement of Göring's residence, a few centimeters from the surface, the archaeologists found 5 human skeletons. All were arranged in the same direction. None had hands, none had feet. The remains belonged to 3 adults, a teenager and a baby. There was no clothing, there were no personal objects, there was nothing that allowed for their immediate identification. The discovery was reported by The Guardian, National Geographic, and Reuters. Polish authorities immediately authorized an official forensic investigation. Teams of experts from the Polish Scientific Police and the Forensic Institute of Krakow began the radiocarbon dating, osteology, and mitochondrial DNA analyses. The absence of limbs raises 2 main hypotheses that researchers are evaluating in parallel. The first is differential decomposition. In soils with a certain chemical composition, distal limbs can degrade more rapidly than the long bones of the central body, especially in the presence of moisture and organic acids. The second, more disturbing, is deliberate pre-mortem or post-mortem mutilation, a practice documented in contexts of summary executions during the German occupation of Poland. Provisional dating suggests that the remains could be situated in a time range spanning from the interwar period to the final years of the German occupation, that is, between the end of the 1930s and January 1945. However, the analyses had not concluded at the time of the closing of this investigation. Who were they? The presence of a baby and a teenager almost completely rules out an execution related to combat. Hypotheses include undocumented prisoners of war, forced laborers of whom no record was kept, or victims of the occupation violence in the East Prussia region, where between 1939 and 1945, the SS and the Gestapo executed civilians with a frequency that German archives only document partially. The Wolf's Lair today has the status of a protected historical monument. It attracts about 200,000 visitors a year. Its overturned bunkers, its flooded corridors, its concrete walls up to 8 meters thick remain standing as a relic. Under that same earth, according to archaeologists, it is likely that more secrets remain to be discovered. 5 bodies without hands or feet, buried under the house of the second most powerful man of the Third Reich. Science works. The questions remain open. On November 18, 1942, at 8:30 in the morning, a Beechcraft 87 Navigator took off from Mather Air Force Base in Sacramento, California. It was a navigation training flight. On board were Second Lieutenant William A. Gamba, pilot in command, and 3 aviation cadets, Ernest G. Munn, John M. Mortensen, and Leo Arvid Mustonen. Mustonen was 22 years old. He was the son of Finnish immigrants, born in Brainerd, Minnesota, and had enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces in his final year of high school. He was intelligent, methodical, with an aptitude for navigation. His instructors described him as one of the most promising cadets in the group. That morning, the flight headed north toward the Sierra Nevada. Weather conditions began to deteriorate over the peaks. Visibility dropped. Lieutenant Gamba maintained course, but the aircraft lost altitude in the vicinity of Kings Canyon National Park. At 10:09 in the morning, the AT-7 impacted against the north slope of Mount Mendel about 91 meters below the summit, at 4,179 meters above sea level. The impact was instantaneous. The 4 crew members died on the spot. The initial search lasted a month. They found nothing. The Sierra Nevada in November is a labyrinth of snow and rock. The plane had been buried under tons of ice from the Darwin Glacier. It was not until 1947, 5 years later, when a hiker ascending through the Darwin Glacier area found fragments of the fuselage and, among the twisted metal remains, frozen tissue with the identification tags of Cadet John M. Mortensen. His remains were recovered. Those of the other 3 men were not. The case was closed. Families were notified, and the glacier continued its imperceptible march, carrying within it 3 bodies that the world had decided to give up as lost. 58 years passed. In October 2005, 2 climbers ascending the Mendel Glacier, a tributary of the Darwin in the same mountain massif, saw something emerging from the ice. A head, arms, an unopened parachute still rolled in its sleeve. A Second World War uniform, perfectly recognizable despite the time. The ice had acted as a perfect cold chamber, slowing bacterial degradation to a near halt. The remains were extracted with extreme care and moved by helicopter to the United States Army Forensic Anthropology Laboratory at Hickam Air Force Base in Oahu, Hawaii. There, a team of forensic anthropologists performed the autopsy. The conclusions were unequivocal: instantaneous death by multiple trauma consistent with a high-velocity impact. The body had been in the glacier for 63 years. Positive identification was obtained through mitochondrial DNA analysis, comparing the genetic material extracted from the femur bone with samples provided by maternal relatives of Leo Arvid Mustonen still living in Minnesota. The match was total. It was him. On March 24, 2006, Mustonen received burial with full military honors at Evergreen Cemetery in Brainerd, Minnesota. The ceremony was attended by veterans, relatives, and representatives of the Air Force. A man who had spent 63 years suspended in the ice of the California mountains was finally returning home. In August 2007, the same glacier gave up another body. This time, the remains of Cadet Ernest G. Munn were identified in March 2008 using mitochondrial DNA. He also received burial with honors in Ohio, his home state. Second Lieutenant William A. Gamba, the pilot in command, was never recovered. A planned expedition for 2009, partially funded by the family, could not be carried out due to lack of funds. The Mendel Glacier advances between 2 and 4 meters annually. Mathematically, Gamba's remains should emerge at some point in that trajectory, but when and in what state no one can know. 3 of the 4 men who took off that November morning in 1942 have been identified and buried with dignity. The 4th remains inside the mountain. Since the year 2003, Takamatsu Gushikan regularly goes out to the forests and rugged terrain of the city of Itoman, at the southern tip of the island of Okinawa, Japan. He carries basic tools, a flashlight, and a red notebook. In that notebook, he has recorded for more than 2 decades the exact location, description, and state of each of the human remains he has found in the caves of the region. At the beginning of 2024, when his work received international attention, the counter in that notebook exceeded 1,400 individuals. The Battle of Okinawa was fought between April 1 and June 22, 1945. It was the largest land operation of the Pacific Theater in the entire war. The United States deployed the 10th Army under the command of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., with more than 182,000 combat soldiers, 1,300 warships, and aerial coverage of approximately 1,500 planes. The Japanese defended the island with the 32nd Army of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, composed of about 100,000 regular soldiers and a forcibly recruited civilian militia. In 82 days of combat, more than 12,000 American soldiers died, about 110,000 Japanese soldiers, and what makes Okinawa one of the most tragic battles of the entire war, between 94,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians, approximately 1/3 of the total population of the island. The limestone caves that pierce the south of Okinawa were the setting for some of the most nightmarish scenes of that summer of 1945. The Japanese army used them as defensive positions, ammunition depots, and improvised field hospitals. The civilian population used them as shelters. When the American Marines began to advance systematically through the terrain, many of those caves became death traps, sealed by the Japanese themselves to prevent surrender, or blocked by bombings that collapsed their entrances with the refugees still inside. There were documented cases of Japanese soldiers killing civilians who tried to surrender, arguing that surrender dishonored the emperor. In other caves, entire families committed collective suicide, persuaded by Japanese military propaganda that the Americans would torture and rape them without exception. In the Himayuri cave, more than 200 auxiliary nurses and their instructors died trapped under the combined fire of both armies. What Gushiken has found in the caves of Itaman are not remains of soldiers. They are predominantly civilians, women, children, elderly people, entire families who sought refuge and never came out. For 2 decades, working mostly alone or with small groups of volunteers, Gushiken has recovered more than 1,400 sets of remains. But the problem he faces, and which makes this discovery one of the most heart-wrenchingly complex in Second World War archaeology, is identification. Of all those remains, only 6 have been identified through DNA analysis, according to data from Japan's own Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, which has supported the program since 2016. Bone degradation caused by tropical humidity, the acidity of the calcareous soil, and the absence of complete family records makes genetic identification extraordinarily difficult. Gushiken, who is 71 years old, carries in his red notebook something more than coordinates and descriptions. He carries the memory that each of those bone fragments was once a person who had a name, a family, and a life that the war interrupted in the summer of 1945. His work has sparked a public debate in Japan about the state's responsibility to the civilian victims of Okinawa, a territory that the Tokyo government continues to consider strategically vital and where tension over North American military bases remains a live political issue. Critical voices point out that the Japanese government has not invested sufficient resources in the identification of victims, and that the majority of the 1,400 recovered remains will end up being buried without a name. At his 71 years, Gushiken still goes out to the caves. He still takes notes, because someone has to do it. On September 25, 2018, public service workers were working in the urban settlement of Angarski, on the western outskirts of Volgograd, the city that until 1961 was called Stalingrad. They were installing a water pipe in a residential housing area when the excavators began to bring up earth containing bones. It was not the first time. In Volgograd, finding a mass grave from the Second World War during a construction project is not a statistical anomaly. Municipal authorities record between 3 and 4 discoveries of this type each year. The city and its surroundings were the scene of the Battle of Stalingrad, fought between August 23, 1942 and February 2, 1943. In those 162 days, according to the estimates most accepted by military historians, between 7 and 2 million people died between both sides, making it the bloodiest battle in human history. But what the Angarski workers had found on September 25 was not an ordinary grave. It was a grave 130 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2 meters deep, and it contained the remains of 1,837 German soldiers. Russian authorities immediately deployed a team of military archaeologists and forensic technicians. The German War Graves Commission, the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgraberfürsorge, was notified and sent its own team of experts to collaborate in the identification. The analyses showed that the bodies had not died in direct combat. There were no bullet wounds or shrapnel injuries suggesting death in action. The signs were different, clear signals of severe malnutrition, hypothermia, and untreated minor wounds. They were men who had died slowly of cold and hunger after the Sixth Army of Feldmarschall Friedrich Paulus was completely encircled by the Soviet forces of the Don Front and the Stalingrad Front in Operation Uranus, which began on November 19, 1942. The Sixth Army was the Wehrmacht's most powerful formation at that time. More than 300,000 men, 500 tanks, and 1,500 artillery pieces. In 2 weeks it was surrounded. Hitler forbade any attempt at a breakout. The aerial supplies from the Luftwaffe, promised by Reichsmarschall Göring, were never sufficient. To keep the encircled army minimally operational, 700 tons of daily supplies were needed. On the best days, 100 were delivered. On the worst, less than 40. Men began to die of cold in mid-December 1942. Temperatures on the Russian steppe that winter dropped to 30 degrees C. There were not enough blankets. There was no coal. Food rations were progressively reduced, first to 300 grams of bread daily, then to 200, finally to less than 100. The soldiers killed and ate the artillery horses. Then they ate leather belts. Then they stopped eating. On February 2, 1943, Paulus, promoted to Feldmarschall only a day before, surrendered. Of the more than 300,000 men who had been encircled, it is calculated that between 90,000 and 110,000 reached the surrender alive. The majority died in Soviet prisoner camps in the following months. Only about 6,000 returned to Germany alive, the last of them in 1955. The 1,837 soldiers of Angarski were among those who died in the pocket before the surrender. Their bodies had been buried in that grave during the winter of 1942-1943, possibly by their own comrades or by the advancing Soviet soldiers. Approximately 20% still carried their identification tags. The rest had been buried as an anonymous mass. In the grave, bottles, keys, belt buckles, a gas mask, and horsebone fragments were also found. On September 12, 2019, after the Volksbund completed its identification work, the remains were moved and buried in the Roshoshka German War Cemetery, 37 kilometers from Volgograd. In that cemetery already rest more than 65,000 German soldiers fallen in the Battle of Stalingrad, whose names are engraved on black basalt plaques. The burial ceremony on September 12, 2019, was attended by more than 50 relatives arriving from Germany. Children who were already elderly, grandchildren who had never known their grandfathers, great-grandchildren carrying flowers for someone who became a number on a list of missing persons 75 years before. The earth had kept those names for decades under the streets of a residential neighborhood. Science was able to rescue some. Most remain faceless. On August 18, 2021, the Institute of National Remembrance of Poland published a statement describing the discovery, in a forested area of the Pomerania region in the north of the country, of a mass grave with the remains of approximately 500 people in the Igielski Woods on the outskirts of Chojnice. It was the first official opening of what Polish historians call the Chojnice Valley of Death, one of the central scenes of the Pomeranian crime of 1939, and one of the most systematically ignored episodes in the catalogue of atrocities from the first months of the Second World War. The German invasion of Poland began on September 1, 1939. In the days immediately following the occupation, units of the Einsatzgruppen, mobile task forces of the SS and security police, began systematically executing the intellectual, political, religious, and administrative elite of the conquered territories. In Pomerania, the northern coastal region that had belonged to Germany before the Treaty of Versailles and that Poland had recovered as access to the sea, this operation received the codename Intelligenzaktion Pommern, Pomeranian Intelligence Action. The objective was explicit in the SS internal documents: to eliminate all elements of the population that could organize a resistance, maintain a Polish identity, or prevent the Germanization of the territory. Teachers, priests, doctors, lawyers, landowners, union leaders, members of the clergy, cultural activists, their families, sometimes simply their neighbors. The dense forests of Pomerania offered perfect natural screens for mass executions. The Igielski woods near Chojnice became one of the main stages. Victims were led in groups, shot at the edge of previously excavated ditches and buried. Later, SS orders included instructions to erase records and disperse witnesses. The most careful historical estimates calculate that between 20,000 and 40,000 people were victims of the Pomeranian crime between September 1939 and the end of 1941. Many of the bodies were never found. The forests kept them for 80 years. The excavation by the Institute of National Remembrance, directed by a team of archaeologists and forensic experts under the supervision of investigating Judge Piotr Kowalski, revealed details that the years had not erased. The skeletons presented bullet holes in the cranial region, consistent with execution shots. Among the bones appeared fragments of crosses, religious medals, and personal objects: a belt buckle, a shirt button with engraved initials, coins. Osteological analyses and soil stratigraphy confirmed that the remains dated from the period between 1939 and 1945. Work continued during 2022 and 2023. By September 2023, the total number of bodies recovered in the Valley of Death had risen to more than 700. Of them, only 120 had been identified thanks to the combination of personal objects, genetic analyses, and matching with lists of missing persons that Polish families had preserved for generations. On September 2, 2024, the Polish state held a state funeral at the minor basilica of St. John the Baptist in Chojnice. The remains of more than 700 people were placed in 188 dark wooden coffins covered with the Polish flag. After the liturgy, a long and silent procession accompanied the caskets to a specially built plot in the cemetery of the victims of German crimes in Chojnice. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk delivered a speech describing the act as the closing of a debt the Polish state had with its murdered citizens. 85 years after the Igielski Woods became a clandestine cemetery, the victims finally received a burial with a name. On March 5, 2017, at a farm in Birkelse, north of Denmark in the North Jutland region, a 14-year-old schoolboy named Daniel Christiansen was doing a project for school. With the help of his father, he was taking a metal detector through the family field, following the instructions of the subject, which asked students to look for historical objects buried in the soil of their properties. It was a local history exercise. Daniel did not expect to find anything relevant. At a certain depth, the detector began to signal insistently. They began to excavate carefully. First, they found metal, a lot of metal, the structure of an aircraft engine, fragments of the fuselage, the recognizable silhouette of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe fighter combat aircraft, of which more than 33,000 units were manufactured between 1937 and the end of the war, the most produced aircraft in the history of Second World War combat aviation to that date. The plane had been buried under the clay soil of Birkelse since October 1944. The humid terrain of northern Denmark had created a low-oxygen environment, practically anaerobic, which had slowed bacterial decomposition to a near halt. Not only the metal was well preserved, the organic materials were too. Along with the remains of the plane, the Christiansens found human remains, and along with the human remains, his identification documents. The Historical Museum of Northern Jutland immediately took over direction of the excavation. A team of archaeologists specializing in aviation and a forensic team from the University of Copenhagen worked for weeks to methodically recover every fragment. The skeletal remains, preserved in an exceptional state by soil conditions, were analyzed in the laboratories of the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Copenhagen. The documents found along with the remains included a Luftwaffe service diary in whose pages dates of flight and mission notations could be read, and a wristwatch with initials engraved on the strap. The cross-referencing of this data with the archives of the Bundesarchiv Militararchiv of Freiburg, which preserves records of Luftwaffe personnel, provided the pilot's identity. His name was Hans Wunderlich. He had been born on July 22, 1925. He was 19 years old when he died. He was a native of Germany and had joined the Luftwaffe as one of the last fighter pilots recruited in the final period of the war, when the Third Reich began recruiting young men of 17 and 18 to compensate for unsustainable losses on the aerial front. It is believed that the plane crashed in October 1944, possibly after an aerial combat over the North Sea, or due to a mechanical failure during a patrol flight over occupied Danish territory. In Denmark, the German occupation began on April 9, 1940, and lasted until May 5, 1945. During that time, more than 6,000 German soldiers died in Danish territory and in the surrounding waters, many in aviation accidents, shipwrecks, and clashes with the Danish resistance. Following official confirmation of Wunderlich's identity, his remains were buried in a German military cemetery in Denmark, where the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgraberversorg maintains several facilities. It has not been established if the family was notified or if direct descendants remain. Something of deeply human value in this discovery stands out. A 14-year-old schoolboy doing schoolwork found in his family's field a 19-year-old youth who had been waiting 73 years for someone to unearth him. Two boys separated by 80 years and by a uniform. One was able to return home, the other finally did too. In 2024, researchers from the Academy of Military Medical Sciences in Beijing published in the scientific journal Emerging Infectious Diseases, edited by the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the results of an analysis carried out on the grounds of the former open-air testing site of Unit 731, located in Anda County, Heilongjiang Province, in northeastern China. The results were alarming. In the soil samples extracted from the site, the researchers detected the presence of viable spores of Bacillus anthracis, the etiological agent of anthrax. Not inactivated historical traces, active spores capable of causing infection under certain exposure conditions. Unit 731 was one of the most secret and lethal biological research units in 20th century military history. Formally established in 1936 under the command of General and Physician Shiro Ishii, it operated under the official cover of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Its central facility was located in Pingfang, a district of Harbin City in Manchuria, Chinese territory occupied by Japan since 1931. The Pingfang complex covered more than 6 square kilometers and included high-containment biological laboratories, human experimentation chambers, crematoria, pathogen production facilities, and a prison where experimentation subjects were kept until used. The prisoners subjected to experimentation came overwhelmingly from the Chinese civilian population, but also included Soviet, Korean, and Mongolian prisoners of war, and in some cases prisoners from other countries. In declassified Japanese military documents and in testimonies collected by researchers for the International Military Tribunal for the Far East Process, prisoners were referred to by the euphemistic term maruta, which means logs. The experiments of Unit 731 included the direct inoculation of Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague bacteria, cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, syphilis, and anthrax. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia to study the progress of diseases in living organs. Subjects were exposed to extreme frostbite to study the effects of hypothermia and the physiological limits of the human body. Blood transfusions were performed between incompatible groups. air was injected into veins to study gas embolisms. Estimates of direct victims of Unit 731 range, depending on the sources, between 3,000 and 12,000 people, although some Chinese researchers consider the real figure could be higher. Historian Sheldon Harris, in his work Factories of Death, 1994, pointed out that the difficulty in establishing exact figures is due in part to the fact that Unit 731 itself methodically destroyed its archive of documentation before the Japanese surrender in August 1945. The Anda outdoor testing field was built in 1941 as the main open-air facility for Unit 731, located about 100 kilometers north of Pingfang. Biological weapons tests were carried out there on a larger scale, detonating ceramic bombs loaded with B. anthracis or Y. pestis at close range to prisoners tied to wooden poles. Hayao Sakaki, commander of the 162nd Manchurian Unit and the largest subunit of Unit 731 based in Lingkou County, testified before the Shenyang Special Military Tribunal in 1956 to having personally witnessed some of these tests. What the study published in 2024 demonstrated, in a way the international scientific community has not been able to ignore, is that the B. anthracis spores found in the soil of Anda genetically match the strains described in the experiments of Unit 731 according to declassified documents. The comparative analysis used next-generation genomic sequencing techniques to match the genetic material of the spores with historical reference samples. The discovery poses an uncomfortable question. If B. anthracis can remain viable in the soil for more than 80 years, what other biological agents persist in the testing sites of Unit 731 that have not been investigated? The Tokyo High Court recognized the existence of the experiments of Unit 731 in 2005. There was never a specific trial for those crimes. None of the scientists and officers of the unit was prosecuted in the Tokyo trials. The United States offered immunity to Ishii and his main collaborators in exchange for the data from their biological research. The bacteria waited 80 years. Justice has not yet arrived. At some point in the first months of 1945, 70 men crawled one after another in near total darkness through a tunnel 1 square meter in section and 18 meters long, excavated with spoons under dormitory number 9 of Island Farm Prisoner of War Camp 198 in Bridgend at South Wales. Outside, the night of March 10, 1945 awaited them. None reached Germany. All were recaptured. The furthest an escapee got was about 120 miles south of Birmingham. But the tunnel they dug became one of the most extraordinary archaeological documents in the history of Allied prisoner camps during the Second World War. Island Farm Camp 198 was not built as a prisoner camp. In 1938, the Bridgend Royal Ordnance Factory established an artillery shell production facility that eventually employed more than 40,000 people at its peak operation. To reduce the staff's travel times, the factory built a camp of wooden barracks on the island farm grounds. The camp proved unpopular with the female workers, who preferred making the long daily journey from their homes rather than sleeping in barracks without thermal insulation. The camp remained empty for several years, until in 1943 it was leased to the American Army to house troops of the 28th Infantry Division in preparation for D-Day. After D-Day, the camp passed to housing German prisoners of war. At the end of 1944, it contained several hundred inmates, mostly officers, many of them members of the Waffen-SS captured during the Normandy campaign. In January 1945, guards discovered a first tunnel attempt started from one of the barracks, where prisoners had removed part of the chimney to access the subsoil. That tunnel was plugged. The prisoners started a new one. The second tunnel, the one that worked, started from Hut 9, the closest to the wire perimeter. It descended nearly 3 meters vertically and then turned horizontally toward the outside, crossing with its 18-meter length the strip of land that separated the barrack from the fence. The section was approximately 1 square meter. The walls had been shored up with pieces of wood stolen from the camp's facilities. Ventilation, One of the most serious problems in any tunnel of these characteristics, as Franz Fonvera had discovered in Derbyshire 4 years earlier, was solved by joining empty milk powder cans from Red Cross packages to build a piping system and a small manual bellows. Lighting was obtained by diverting a cable from the barracks' electrical installation. The problem was the excavated earth. Hut 9 had a volume of earth to hide equivalent to tens of cubic meters. Burying it in the garden was too visible. Dispersing it through the yard was impracticable. The solution was one of dazzling ingenuity. At one end of a large L-shaped room, the prisoners built a false wall of a single layer of bricks, perfectly plastered with the same material as the rest of the wall. Behind that wall, they began to deposit the earth, formed into small balls to facilitate stacking. When guards checked the barrack, the wall looked identical to the rest of the construction. Nobody discovered the wall during the war. On the night of March 10, 1945, 70 prisoners crossed the tunnel in silence and dispersed through the Welsh countryside. 4 stole a small Austin car belonging to a local doctor and tried to reach Croydon Airfield with the intention of stealing a plane. They did not reach Gloucester before running out of fuel. They were captured at Castle Bromwich near Birmingham. The others were recaptured in the following hours and days, in a radius of a few kilometers from the camp, with the exception of 2 who reached Southampton before being detained. After the war, Camp 198 was used as a high-ranking facility, housing figures such as Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt and Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein until their repatriation in 1948. The camp was then dismantled. In the 1980s, police officer Reggie Dodson, a local history enthusiast, accidentally discovered the false wall while inspecting the concrete buildings that still stood. Behind the wall, perfectly stacked, were still all the clay balls that the prisoners had extracted from the tunnel 40 years earlier. In 2003, Hut 9 was subjected to an archaeological investigation with ground-penetrating radar, complemented by a mechanical excavation. The result was surprising. The tunnel remained intact under the floor, with its wooden shoring structure in a good state of conservation nearly 60 years after its installation. The vertical entry shaft had suffered a small collapse, but the main horizontal section was perfectly traversable. Hut 9 of Island Farm was declared a protected building under Great Britain's historical heritage legislation. The tunnel, still under the soil of Bridgend, waits for the visitor who one day fully opens it. On May 27, 1941, at 10:39 in the morning, the German battleship Bismarck sank in the North Atlantic at coordinates 48°10 N, 16°12 W, approximately 650 kilometers west of the French coast of Brittany. The battle had lasted less than 2 hours. The British ships, HMS Rodney, HMS King George V, HMS Dorsetshire, and HMS Maori, had concentrated their fire on the German battleship after torpedoes from a swordfish from HMS Ark Royal disabled its rudder the previous night, leaving it turning in circles in the open Atlantic. The Bismarck was the largest and most modern warship of the Kriegsmarine at the time of its launch in 1939. It displaced 50,300 tons at full load. It was 251 meters long. Its main 380mm guns had a range of 36 kilometers. It had entered action barely 8 days before its sinking when, together with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, it faced the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the battleship HMS Prince of Wales in the Denmark Strait. In the exchange of fire, the Hood, the largest and most famous warship of the Royal Navy, exploded and sank in less than 3 minutes. Of its crew of 1,418 men, 3 survived. The sinking of the Hood sparked one of the most intense naval hunts of the war. The Royal Navy's Home Fleet deployed practically all its operational resources in the North Atlantic. The Bismarck was located 2 days later, on May 26, by a long-range Catalina patrol plane. The attack by the Swordfish of the Ark Royal sealed its fate. Of the 2,200 men aboard the Bismarck when it was sunk, British ships rescued 116. Casualties amounted to more than 2,000, including Admiral Gunther Lütjens and the ship's commander, Captain Ernst Lindemann. For decades, the exact location of the wreck was only approximate. In 1989, American oceanographer Robert Ballard, the same man who had found the Titanic 4 years earlier, located the remains of the Bismarck using side-scan sonar technology and remotely operated vehicles. The hull rested on the bottom of the Atlantic at 4,791 meters deep. Subsequent underwater archaeological investigations, carried out with high-definition ROVs in expeditions in 2001 and 2002, revealed something that naval historians did not expect. The hull of the Bismarck had reached the bottom practically intact, without the signs of pressure implosion that would have been characteristic of a hull that sinks with sealed watertight compartments. This suggested, according to the researchers who analyzed the state of the wreck, that the ship had reached the seabed with its watertight doors open, which in turn is consistent with the hypothesis that the crew intentionally opened the scuttling valves to sink the vessel and prevent its capture, an action that would have begun while the ship was still under British fire. The controversy between the British sank it and the Germans sank it has been debated for decades in naval history circles. Archaeological analyses of the state of the hull, carried out by the team of the 2002 expedition, in which Admiral Lutyens's grandson participated, point out that the ship received sufficient damage to be incapacitated but not to be sunk immediately, and that the final sinking was accelerated by the deliberate opening of the scuttling valves. The remains of the Bismarck remain at the bottom of the Atlantic. They are the grave of more than 2,000 men, recognized as such by international legislation protecting war wrecks. No expedition has been able to answer with certainty all the questions it poses. They remain down there at nearly 5 kilometers deep, waiting. Not all Second World War discoveries in the 21st century are execution pits or crashed planes. Some are quieter, and precisely for that reason, they are equally disturbing. In a prisoner of war camp, whose exact location is documented in the archives of the National Heritage List for England, but whose name is withheld for heritage management reasons, archaeologist Gabriel Moszenska and his team carried out an excavation in one of the camp's trash pits in the first decade of the 21st century. What they found were not weapons or secret documents. They were the everyday waste of men who had lived in that camp for months or years between 1944 and 1948. Shirt buttons, earthenware and glass bottles, food cartons, canned meat tins, identity cards, worn razor blades, nail brushes and toothbrushes, hundreds of toothbrushes. This detail, apparently trivial, condenses something that history books do not usually capture. The men who lived in those camps wanted to maintain their hygiene, their dignity, a routine that reminded them they were people and not simply numbers in an army record. Analyses of the contents of the tins found in the pit revealed that most of the protein consumed by the prisoners came from canned meat, consistent with the standard rations of British camps distributed by the International Red Cross. This has its context within the framework of the Third Geneva Convention of 1929, to which both Great Britain and Germany had adhered, though not Japan or the Soviet Union. The convention established that prisoners of war should receive food equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the captor country's own troops, housing comparable to that of their guards' barracks, and access to international correspondence. In general terms, British prisoner camps complied with these rules, something that marked an abysmal difference from the treatment Soviet prisoners received in German camps, where mortality reached 57% of the total captured. But what the archaeology of these camps reveals that documents do not show is the human detail. How a man resolves his melancholy by building a chessboard with wooden fragments from a broken bed, how another transforms his aluminum mess mug into a decorated object with engravings reproducing the landscape of his hometown, how another digs a small garden next to his barrack and plants seeds from a lettuce a guard has given him, because growing something, seeing something grow, is a way of affirming that time moves forward and that the camp is not the end. Harperley Camp in County Durham is one of the best preserved German prisoner of war camps in Great Britain. Its wooden huts, its fences, its latrines, its improvised theatre where prisoners performed plays and held concerts, its chapel with an altar hand-painted by a prisoner artist whose name was not recorded in any document. On its interior walls remain mural paintings made with paints obtained by mixing mud and vegetable pigments, showing alpine landscapes, scenes of the German countryside, imaginary portraits of people the authors would probably never see again. Harperley is today a Grade II listed historical heritage site. Its murals are unique documents. No history book recorded them, no archive catalogued them, only the earth and the walls kept them. On the coast of Sussex, in southern England, there is a valley that descends gently between white chalk cliffs to the sea. It is called Cuckmere Haven. In days of calm, sheep graze on the valley floor, tourists walk the paths, and children ride bicycles down to the beach. It is a recognized place of peace. Beneath that landscape of peace, the war is still there. When in 1940 the German Army intelligence services drew up their list of priority landing zones for Operation Sea Lion, the projected invasion of Great Britain, Cuckmere Haven appeared in the list with a specific notation: landing zone assigned to the 6th Mountain Division. The wide valley, the accessible beach, and the direct route toward London made it a first-rate tactical objective. The British Army knew it, or assumed it, and acted accordingly. In the early months of 1940, Cuckmere Haven was transformed into an invisible fortress. Anti-tank guns were installed in the cliffs, with fields of fire covering the entire beach. Concrete pillboxes with machine guns and sniper posts were built on the valley slopes. Mines and barbed wire were spread on the beach itself. On the flat floor of the valley, perpendicular to the direction of advance, a barrier of concrete blocks that engineers called Dragon's Teeth was built, supported by a network of anti-tank ditches more than 4 meters wide filled with water. And further up, in fields that from afar looked empty, electrical structures with lights over pools of water were installed, bombing decoys designed to imitate at night, from the air, the luminous profile of New Haven Harbour and thus divert Luftwaffe bombings toward empty ground. None of this was ever used. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely in September 1940, after the Luftwaffe failed to obtain the necessary air superiority. The invasion never arrived. The concrete blocks stayed in the valley. The pillboxes stayed in the cliffs. The anti-tank ditches were gradually filled in so the land could become cultivable again. Half a century later, in 1995, the Council for British Archaeology launched the Defence of Britain project, mobilising more than 600 volunteers to record the remains of Second World War British coastal defences. By the time the project closed in 2002, they had catalogued more than 20,000 sites across British territory. Cuckmere Haven was identified as, according to official project documentation, possibly the best surviving group of coastal defence works, with pillboxes of various types excavated into the cliffs, large anti-tank cubes, an anti-tank wall, and open stretches of anti-tank ditch. In 2002, the Defence Areas Project used that data to study landscapes where defences had survived as a whole, as complete systems and not as isolated elements. In Cuckmere Haven, the system had survived almost intact. The concrete blocks that today's tourists take for natural features, the irregular steps on the cliffside that look like simple erosion, the grass-covered mounds of earth that no one identifies as bunkers. All that is the material testimony of a plan that was never executed, of an invasion that never arrived, of thousands of men who spent months guarding that valley because they had been told that was where the enemy would arrive. He did not arrive, but the preparation to receive him left scars on the earth that archaeology is still learning to read. The story of Cadet Leo Mustonen and his companions from the Mendel Glacier closes one chapter but leaves another open. Second Lieutenant William A. Gamba, the pilot in command of the navigation flight of November 18, 1942, was never recovered. In scientific work following the discovery of Mustonen in 2005 and Mun in 2007, geologists from the United States Geological Survey who studied the behavior of the Sierra Nevada glaciers calculated with available glacier movement models the probable trajectory of Gamba's remains. The Mendel Glacier advances between 1, 5 and 4 meters per year, depending on snowfall and average seasonal temperatures. From the impact point of the AT-7 Navigator in 1942, Gamba's remains would have traveled over 8 decades, a distance that models place in the glacier's terminal zone or its immediate piedmont. The problem is that the Mendel Glacier, like all Sierra Nevada glaciers, is retreating at an accelerated rate due to climate change. Its length has decreased by approximately 30% since the mid-20th century. This means that Gamba's remains could be on ground that was previously glacier and is now exposed rock or terminal moraine, which exponentially complicates their location. The search expedition planned for 2009, organized with partial funding from the Gamba family, could not be carried out due to lack of funds. No subsequent official expedition has been scheduled. The remains of Second Lieutenant William A. Gamba technically remain in the category of missing in action. This case is emblematic of a larger problem that Second World War archaeology increasingly faces in the context of climate change. Glaciers that acted for decades as involuntary preservers of the dead are melting, and with them human remains are being released in conditions that researchers cannot always foresee or control. In the Italian Alps, in the glaciers of Norway, in the Sierra Nevada of California, the ice is returning to the surface bodies of soldiers, pilots and mountaineers who were buried between 1940 and 1945. Geographer Nicolas Pepin from the University of Portsmouth published in 2019 a study projecting that 60% of the glaciers in the European Alps could disappear before the year 2100. In the same Alps, where in the First World War more than 10,000 Austro-Hungarian and Italian soldiers died in avalanches, high mountain combat, or simply from the cold, and whose remains the glaciers have been gradually returning throughout the 20th century. The war continues to be unearthed. The time that hid it now exposes it. And there are not always teams, resources, or political will to receive it. The Wolfschanze was not just the bunkers that any tourist can visit today. It was a system of underground infrastructure whose total extent has never been fully mapped. Engineers from the Todt organization, the Third Reich's civil and military engineering corps that built, among other works, the Atlantic Wall and the V-1 launch bunkers in France, began work on the Wolf's Lair in early 1941. The first phase included 17 command and residential bunkers with concrete walls between 4 and 8 meters thick in the most protected. Hitler had his own bunker 10 meters thick and reinforced roof against 2,000-kilogram bombs. In 1943, after Allied bombings over Germany demonstrated that no surface installation was completely safe, a second phase of construction was initiated that included the expansion of underground systems. Part of that second phase was never fully documented in the German archives that reached Allied hands after the war. The reasons are several. The Todt engineers themselves who supervised the second phase were, in some cases, executed or disappeared in the final months of the Reich. The first phase documents that survived were incomplete, and in January 1945, when German forces evacuated the facility in 48 hours before the advance of Marshal Georgy Zhukov's Belarusian front, the explosives placed in the bunkers partially detonated, collapsing some corridors and sealing others. Archaeological expeditions carried out since 2010 with ground-penetrating radar have identified underground anomalies in several areas of the complex that do not correspond to any structure documented in known plans. Some of those anomalies have dimensions consistent with access corridors, others with chambers or storerooms. What is in those chambers? Archaeologists from the Leitbra Foundation, which directs investigations at the site, are cautious. Most could simply be ground collapses, natural variations in the subsoil composition, or spaces left by the detonation of the bunkers. But some of the anomalies have profiles that the team's forensic engineers have not been able to explain satisfactorily. It was in the context of these investigations that, in February 2024, the team found the 5 skeletons under Göring's house. What they also found, and which published reports mention only in passing, is that there are at least 2 additional underground anomalies in the first security zone sector that have not yet been directly investigated. Polish authorities have authorized the continuation of the excavations. The wolf's lair still has secrets. The earth is keeping them. The question is, what will happen when they come to light? In the winter of 1940, at Swanwick Hayes, a stately mansion converted into a prisoner of war camp in Derbyshire, a group of Luftwaffe officers founded a clandestine construction company. They called themselves, with a humour only someone in their situation could appreciate, Swanwick Tiefbau AG Swanwick Deep Excavations Public Limited Company. Its managing director was Lieutenant Franz Fonvera. Fonvera, born in 1914 in Leuk, Switzerland, and raised by adoptive parents in Germany, had joined the Luftwaffe in 1936. In 1940, as adjutant of the 2nd Group of Jagdgeschwader 3, he participated in the campaign of France and in the Battle of Britain. On September 5, 1940, his plane was intercepted over London by Spitfires. With the engine damaged, he made an emergency landing in a field at Love's Farm near Marden in Kent. He was captured unharmed, paradoxically by the cook of an anti-aircraft unit. From that capture began one of the most extraordinary escape itineraries of the war. Fonvera was moved successively to Maidstone Barracks, the London District Cage at Kensington Palace Gardens for the first interrogation, the Combined Services Interrogation Centre at Trent Park, where dormitories were bugged and spies posed as cellmates to extract additional information, and finally to the first and only officers' prisoner camp at Grisdale Hall in the Lake District. There he made his first escape attempt, hiding in a shepherd's hut. They found him in a mud puddle after several days outdoors. Transferred to Swanwick Hayes, Fonvera organized the company. In December 1940, after a month of work with spoons, metal bowls, and any improvised object they could steal, the tunnel was finished, 30 meters long from the dormitory to the other side of the security fence. On the night of the planned escape, Fonvera and several companions crossed the tunnel. His plan was to pose as a downed Dutch pilot and convince an RAF base to let him board a plane. At Hucknall Air Base, he managed to reach a plane and start studying the controls before being arrested at gunpoint. It was his last attempt on British soil. In January 1941, they embarked him toward Canada. From the train taking him to the camp, he jumped out near Montreal. He crossed the frozen St. Lawrence River into the United States, then still neutral, and reached Ogdensburg, New York, becoming a media sensation. From there, he traveled through Peru, Brazil, and Spain until reaching Germany, acclaimed as a hero. He was the only German prisoner of war to achieve a complete escape from Allied custody during the entire war. In October 1941, his plane disappeared over the North Sea during operations on the Eastern Front. No trace was found. But the Swanwick Tunnel is still there. Today, Swanwick Hayes is a Christian conference centre. The centre's managers are aware of the site's history, and the tunnel, according to the latest available records, remains intact under the garden. It has not been archaeologically investigated with modern means, but it exists. 30 meters of history excavated with spoons, kept under the soil of Derbyshire, waiting. Somewhere in Great Britain, under the playground of a primary school that has been in operation for decades, there is a Second World War air raid shelter sealed and nearly forgotten. Gabriel Moshenska, archaeologist at the UCL Institute of Archaeology, excavated one of these shelters in the first decade of the 21st century. It was a reinforced concrete Anderson shelter, buried less than 2 meters deep below the playground level, with access through a metal ladder that the years had rusted into almost dust. The shelter had been sealed after the war, partially filled with earth and demolition material, and literally forgotten beneath the pavement installed over it in the 1950s. When Moshenska's team opened the access and descended, they found the shelter in a state of temporal suspension that made it look like a snapshot from 1944. The wooden benches where children sat during the bombings were still in place, although the wood had warped and cracked over the years. On the concrete walls at a child's arm height, there were names engraved with coins or nails, first names, nicknames, some with dates. Bert, 1943. Mary and Joan, 1944. On the floor, among the sludge accumulated by water filtration over decades, were objects: a child's gas mask, of the type the British government distributed in 1938 in a special model for children, with the filter and mask painted in primary colours to make them less terrifying. A flattened rubber ball, a school uniform button. The historical context of this discovery has its own weight. Between September 1940 and May 1941, the German Blitz over British cities killed more than 43,000 civilians, injured more than 139,000, and destroyed more than 1 million homes. The bombing of London lasted 57 consecutive nights without interruption between September 7, 1940, and November 2, 1940. Schools in the bombed cities functioned with interruptions, with students evacuated to the countryside in the largest evacuation operation in British history, and with classes taught in the shelters when bombings were continuous. What the shelter excavated by Moshenska captured was not just the history of the bombings, it was the history of the children who were down there, in the darkness and the noise of the bombs, engraving their names on the walls because they wanted to leave testimony that they were alive, that they had been there, that they existed. Decades later, in the 21st century, an archaeologist read those names, and for a moment the children were alive again. In Harperley Camp in County Durham in northeastern England, time did something infrequent. Instead of erasing the traces of the past, it preserved them. Harperley was a prisoner of war camp established in early 1943 to house Italian prisoners captured in North Africa after General Bernard Montgomery's victories at El Alamein. By the autumn of 1943, after the Italian surrender of September 8, the status of the prisoners changed in a strange way. Italy was now a co-belligerent ally of the Allies, which turned the captured Italian soldiers into an ambiguous category of cooperators, who were allowed to work outside the camp with greater freedom in exchange for better conditions. Many Italian prisoners in camps like Harperley, instead of attempting escapes, channeled their energies into artistic production. What remains on the walls of several of Harperley's buildings, declared in 2002 as one of the best preserved prisoner of war camps in Great Britain and protected as a Grade II historical heritage site, is a group of mural paintings of a quality and emotionality that amaze those who visit them. Painted with improvised pigments mixed with mud, lime, and organic materials, they show landscapes of the Italian countryside, scenes of daily life before the war, idealized portraits of women who were probably wives or mothers remembered from a distance, and religious representations revealing the centrality of Catholicism in the identity of those men. The camp's improvised theatre, built by the prisoners themselves, still has today a stage painted with sets recreating the columns of the Roman Forum. The backdrop shows the Colosseum. In the stands where the prisoners sat to watch their companions' performances, the wooden seats have the names of the men who occupied them engraved on their backrests. These objects, these paintings, these names, they do not appear in any official document of the war. No correspondent recorded them. No officer photographed them. They only survived because nobody bothered to destroy them when the camp was dismantled in 1948. And because in the following decades the building was used as a barn, which kept its interiors dry and away from destructive moisture. In the 21st century, when archaeologists began to document Harperley, what they found was a human archive of people who had been in captivity, who had been afraid, who had felt nostalgia, who had loved, who had prayed, and who had left all that imprinted on the wooden and concrete walls of a camp in Durham, waiting for someone to see them. Among the many forms Second World War archaeology takes in the 21st century, there is one especially quiet: the excavation of plots where the houses that the bombs destroyed once stood. In London, several neighbourhoods of the East End, south of the river, and port areas like the Docklands preserved for decades after the war, empty plots where buildings had been demolished by bombs without any new builder arriving to raise anything. The soil of those plots, covered in grass and weeds, contained for years the ruins of those houses' foundations, and buried among the rubble the remains of the domestic life of the families who had lived in them. In excavations carried out in the context of the urban development of the London 2012 Olympic area, which forced the excavation of extensive areas of the East End before the construction of sports facilities, Archaeologists from Oxford Archaeology and the Museum of London Archaeology found in several plots with bombing remains collections of everyday objects that had been buried under the ruins of their own houses. Porcelain breakfast cups, brass photo frames, clothing, cutlery, coins and toys. Painted tin trucks, some with wheels still turning in the conservation laboratory when cleaned of the layer of earth and lime that had covered them for 60 years. Porcelain dolls with wool hair still partially intact. Wooden spinning tops, lead soldiers. The context in which those toys were found in the ruins of houses destroyed by bombs under layers of debris and plaster gives them a dimension that an object in a museum or a private collection cannot have. Those toys were not abandoned, they were buried alive. The bombs fell on the houses while families were in the shelters or in the basements, and when the surviving families returned after the bombing, they found nothing recoverable, only ruins. The objects that today are in the warehouses of London's archaeological museums, catalogued with acronyms and inventory numbers, are not just artifacts. They are the last image of a life that existed and that a bomb interrupted in a fraction of a second. On June 26, 2012, during construction work for the Olympic Games facilities in London in the East End, workers excavating a plot in Stratford found an unexploded German SC-250 bomb, buried about 4 meters deep. The bomb, with 250 kilograms of explosive charge and more than a meter long, had fallen during the Blitz, probably in the winter of 1940-1941, had penetrated the ground without detonating due to a fuse failure, and had remained there for 71 years, perfectly capable of exploding. Royal Army disposal teams proceeded to the controlled deactivation of the bomb. Nobody was injured. It was not the only case. Throughout the preparations for the Olympic Park, several additional units of unexploded ammunition from the Second World War were found, including anti-aircraft artillery shells, hand grenades, and several incendiary containers. This phenomenon is not exclusive to London. In Hamburg, Berlin, Munich and Cologne, the German cities that suffered the most intensive bombings from the British Royal Air Force and the North American 8th Air Force between 1942 and 1945, explosive disposal specialists from the Kampfmittelraumdienst manage between 500 and 2,000 alert calls each year for unexploded ammunition discovered in construction sites, private gardens and riverbeds. Hamburg, a city that received more than 3,000 tons of bombs only in Operation Gomorrah from July 24 to 30, 1943, continues to find unexploded ammunition in proportions that experts estimate will not be exhausted before the year 2100. In Belgium and northern France, the phenomenon is double. To the Second World War bombs are added the unexploded shells of the First, the so-called iron harvest, the iron harvest that farmers in the Flanders and Somme region continue to collect every ploughing season. Belgian Army explosive disposal teams process between 150 and 200 tons of ammunition from the two world wars each year. The Second World War did not stop killing when the Berlin Armistice was signed on May 8, 1945. Its unexploded bombs have killed hundreds of people in Europe since then, in construction sites, in farm fields, in dredged rivers, on eroded beaches. The soil of Europe remains an active archive, and that archive can still kill. The Second World War officially ended on September 2, 1945, when General Douglas MacArthur accepted the surrender of the Japanese Empire aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But for some Japanese soldiers, the war did not end that day. Lieutenant Hiru Onoda was stationed on Lubang Island in the Philippines in December 1944. His orders were to resist at any cost. When the war ended, Onoda did not believe it. He considered the surrender documents he found to be enemy propaganda. He continued fighting in the Lubang jungle for 29 years, carrying out guerrilla operations, destroying rice crops of local villages, and killing several Filipino policemen and civilians. He did not surrender until March 9, 1974, when his former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, was personally flown to Lubang to hand him the official surrender order. Onoda was 52 years old. In the Solomon Islands archipelago and on Iwo Jima, 21st century archaeological work has revealed remains of Japanese combat positions and defensive systems that remained in use decades after the official end of hostilities, simply because some combatants did not receive or did not accept the surrender order. But what the archaeology of Pacific battlefields has revealed most consistently in the last 20 years has to do not with the combatants who survived, but with those who did not. On Iwo Jima, where between February 19 and March 26, 1945, approximately 6,800 American Marines and more than 21,000 Japanese soldiers died on an island of 21 square kilometers. Archaeological work funded by the Japanese American Veterans Association has located through ground-penetrating radar in the last 15 years the underground tunnel systems that Japanese engineers dug under the island, some more than 20 meters deep. In those tunnels, analyses confirmed the presence of human remains that still cannot be recovered due to terrain conditions and lack of resources. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers who died on Iwo Jima, it is estimated that less than half have been formally located and recovered. Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare manages a search and recovery program that has identified since its creation in 1952 the remains of approximately 350,000 of the 4 million Japanese soldiers who died outside Japanese territory between 1937 and 1945. Approximately 2 million Japanese soldiers remain unrecovered on the battlefields of Asia and the Pacific, 2 million men whom the Earth has not yet returned. There are discoveries for which archaeology, forensic anthropology and genetics have answers, and there are others for which they do not have them yet. The 5 skeletons without hands or feet under Goering's house at the Wolf's Lair remain unidentified with certainty while this script is being written. Mitochondrial DNA analyses extracted from the bones of the 3 adults have not found matches in any genetic database of relatives of the missing. The baby and the teenager have bone degradation that complicates the extraction of sufficient genetic material for analysis. Polish authorities have not published the results of the radiocarbon analysis, and the silence surrounding that specific aspect of the investigation has generated speculation among historians about whether the dating results pose an uncomfortable chronology. The Bacillus anthracis spores found at the Unit 731 Ander test field represent a different scientific challenge. The survival capacity of anthrax spores has been extensively documented. The most cited example in scientific literature is the Scottish island of Gruinard, where the British government carried out tests with anthrax bombs in 1942 and where the soil remained contaminated with viable spores until it was subjected to a massive decontamination with formaldehyde and seawater between 1986 and 1987. 44 years of active contamination in a territory that had not been subjected to any purification process. In Ander, tests were carried out between 1941 and 1945. The soil has not been subjected to any formal decontamination process. If the spores found in 2024 are viable, as suggested by preliminary data from the study published in Emerging Infectious Diseases, the question science has difficulty answering is not what the Chinese researchers found. The question is, what else is in that soil that has not yet been analyzed? In the glaciers of the Sierra Nevada, the unanswered question is geological and forensic at the same time. How many more bodies of Second World War soldiers, pilots and civilians are being released by accelerated glacial retreat across the Northern Hemisphere, and whether forensic identification teams have the resources to receive and process them before atmospheric exposure destroys the genetic material they contain. In Volgograd, the unanswered question is demographic. If in the Angarski residential settlement a single grave with 1,837 German soldiers was found, and if the city records between 3 and 4 similar findings per year, how many victims of the Battle of Stalingrad from both sides remain buried under the streets and parks and gardens of the city that saw the bloodiest battle in human history? The answer historians handle, supported by calculations from the German War Graves Commission and Russian forensic teams, is possibly tens of thousands more, perhaps more than 100,000. In the Chojnice Valley of Death, the unanswered question is genetic and political. Of the more than 700 bodies recovered until September 2023, only 120 have been identified. The rest remain nameless, buried in a collective grave in the Chojnice cemetery with a plaque saying simply, "Victims of German crimes." They have no name, they have no family to claim them, they have no individual history recovered. DNA analyses are expensive and complex, and bone degradation makes many samples insufficient for extraction. And finally, in the battlefields of the Pacific, on Okinawa, on Iwo Jima, in the jungles of New Guinea and Burma, in the archipelagos of the Central Pacific, the question science cannot answer yet is how many bodies remain buried or preserved in tunnels and caves that have not been found yet, and how many never will be. It is estimated that there are approximately 2 million missing Japanese soldiers in the exterior theaters of the war. Several 100,000 unrecovered German soldiers are estimated on the Eastern Front. More than 1 million fallen Soviet soldiers whose mass graves have not been located are estimated. Hundreds of thousands of civilians from Eastern Europe, China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific who were executed died of hunger or disease, or became trapped in collapsed structures and have no identified grave are estimated. 80 years after the end of the Second World War, most of its dead have still not returned home. There is something that all the discoveries we have covered in this script have in common, something that goes beyond the macabre nature of the circumstances of each individual finding. In all these cases, the Earth kept what the world tried to forget. The bodies under Göring's house, the soldiers in the California glacier, the civilians in the Okinawa caves, the Germans dead of hunger in the Stalingrad winter, the Poles executed in the Pomeranian forests, the Danish pilot in his plane, the anthrax bacteria in the Manchurian testing grounds. None of them was forgotten because the world wanted to remember them. They were forgotten precisely because the world did not want to do so. Archives were destroyed, witnesses died, places were covered with earth, with asphalt, with grass, with water. People built over them, people sewed over them, people lived over them without knowing what was underneath. And then, 80 years later, the Earth returned them. A 14-year-old schoolboy in Denmark doing a school project, a public service worker opening a trench for a pipe in Volgograd, a 71-year-old volunteer in Okinawa with a red notebook, a detective historian in Bridgend who hit a wall that sounded hollow, Chinese researchers taking soil samples at an abandoned testing field in Manchuria. It was not large government programs or scientific missions with million-dollar budgets that found most of these secrets. It was ordinary people paying attention to the earth they stepped on. The Second World War killed between 70 and 85 million people, depending on which methodology is used to calculate the figure. Of those people, the majority died far from home, in lands that were not theirs, in circumstances that no one documented rigorously. Their names are not on any monument, their stories are not in any book. Their DNA is in bones buried under glaciers, caves, residential plots, military testing grounds, and anonymous trenches. Second World War archaeology is, at its deepest core, the attempt to return to those people their individual existence, their name, their story, their death with a proper name instead of a number on a casualty list. It does not always succeed. Science has limits, budgets have limits. Time degrades DNA and bones and personal objects into dust. Many dead will never be identified. But the attempt matters. The act of excavating, of analyzing, of publishing, of organizing funeral ceremonies with coffins for people who died 80 years ago without anyone closing their eyes. That act has a meaning that goes beyond history as an academic discipline. It is the recognition that every human life, even when it has been destroyed by the worst war in history, deserves a name. The Earth continues to keep its secrets. Every year, at some point on the planet, the Second World War returns to the surface, and someone has to be there to receive it.